One day, I got some mail. That's not particularly interesting or new. I got mail about emulated software. Also, not really interesting or new. When you have such a weird in-browser emulation at the Internet Archive, you can't help but get people kind of confused about what the technical process is to make software work. The amount of people who have just understood how that system works by observing other items and doing experiments is vanishingly small. Less than 100 people have really taken on the challenge. But one person mailed me over and over, asking why a certain machine wasn't being supported. And initially, I looked at it and said, "Isn't it obvious?" But he kept pressing, and he kept asking me to make it work. And once it got working, the rewards that came back were unbelievable. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. I don't mind sharing his name. It's James Gerrie. James started writing me about the Radio Shack MC-10. I hadn't even heard of the MC-10. Neither did a lot of people. The MC-10 was Radio Shack's answer to the ZX Spectrum, which itself was an attempt to build a truly accessible, low-cost computer, no matter what the sacrifices were to make that happen. The MC-10 was itself a low-cost version of the Tandy color computer and the TRS-80. It shared some of the architecture of those machines, but at a much lower powered rate. Much like the ZX Spectrum, the MC-10 didn't just have anemic specs. It had ruinously terrible specs. If you had been told even a few years later that somebody was going to build and market a computer with these specifications, they would have been laughed out of the room. In fact, not only was the MC-10 a rather weak machine, it almost came standard with a RAM pack to allow it to be able to do even the most basic work. That said, it sold a certain amount, and clearly, through a series of haphazard life history, James Gerrie loved this machine. Because of that rather simple architecture, and because MAME emulated the TRS-80 and Coco and other Tandy hardware, the MC-10 was one of the supported machines. I had just never done the 10 to 15 minute process of making it work within the Internet Archive's emulation. And I want to stress, each step that I did showed me that my initial instincts were correct. You see, when you boot an MC-10, it just sits there. It doesn't do anything. It is such a fundamentally weak machine that starting it up makes you think nothing's working. But it is working. What it's doing is waiting for you to start the tape player. In MAME, tape players are handled kind of weirdly. I've done other tape-based machinery on the archive, and all of them require you to do something that is a user interface killer. I'm a big fan of the way that arcade machines work on the archive. You start the program, it self-tests, it always passes the self-tests because it's just a series of digital files, and then it goes into an attract mode, asking you to press a key to insert a quarter and start the game. But computers were not always that easy. And so the MC-10 requires you to press the scroll lock key. And for many people, this is their first encounter with the scroll lock key having any meaning whatsoever. You see, The MAME developers made a decision some time ago when it came to emulating computers. You would want access to every key on the computer, but then you ran into the problem of how do you tell MAME what to do? So initially, many of the computers just work. But if you want to use any MAME keys, any keys to look at all of the configuration or make changes, you have to press scroll lock, meaning the keyboard doesn't work exactly the same and you can do configuration. In the case of the MC10, you press scroll lock and then the F2 key, function 2, please press play on the virtual cassette tape machine that is sitting next to the virtual machine. When you do that, a counter pops up, and it tells you how many sectors of tape are running through the cassette machine. From there, the MC10 starts loading in all of the tape and then stops. And then you have to press run or exec and start it running. Like I said, this is a user interface killer. Unless you know exactly what you want to do, most people don't want to do this. But what comes out the other end is, to my sort of temperament, unbelievably rewarding. Having been given a functioning MC10 emulation, James has been working very hard, uploading hundreds of MC10 titles, personally, one after another, adding descriptions, adding key press charts, adding everything you need to play these games. And the games are weird. Really weird. Some of them are clearly of the vintage of the MC10, the early 1980s. They are versions of board games or simple number games that make sense that they would only be in a few K of memory. But others are weird. Games like Dig Dug and Missile Command, games like Risk or Pop-Tart Cat demos, or references to games that only came out a couple years ago. All of them running on the MC10. And when I say running, I mean, imagine you've been given a glass of some sort of delicious drink, and then somebody put it through a tiny pipette, producing a little small shot glass of what the original drink was, and that's what you're seeing. The resolution on the MC10 is basic beyond words. It's got full color, which is appreciated, but a lot of things that computer programs would work on are heavy lifting for the MC10. Which is why I want to highlight this collection. archive.org/details/software library, one word, _MC10. Because James, as he goes past hundreds and hundreds of titles, is curating a most fascinating reinvention of what the joy of computers are. I feel like that's not something that's really thought of much in the modern era. The pure joy of working with a limited set of components, a limited amount of memory, having to think your way out of a problem, and not just falling over to what a hardware upgrade or what an unlimited color palette can do for you. Being able to take a 16-bit wave sample and play it every time the player presses fire is a certain kind of solution, and certainly for games that are relatively difficult and complicated, involving many different people in separate teams, removing any barriers of technical capability and allowing folks to collaborate is to be expected. But there's a certain charm, a certain impact printing, handwritten note feel to a computer program where somebody is working in the kilobytes to produce some sort of analog, almost a poem, of a more complicated gaming or computer experience. That's really magical to me. I mean, I'll be frank. We've kind of finished with the emulation at the archive. It works. While it's currently very hard to get the most up-to-date programs and the most up-to-date operating systems running, the 250,000+ titles that you can walk through, representing 20 and 30 years of computer history, will keep you tided over until machines either get faster or something knocks WebAssembly off its perch to make running programs in browsers even better. You have a lot to go through. You have video games and handheld games and all sorts of chess machines, mahjong machines, and the titles on computers and computer programs written just a few weeks ago, going back all the way to the 1970s and even the 1960s. There's a library of material just waiting for people to walk through. I've curated what I can, but I can't do it alone. And if something doesn't personally grab me, if the case can't be made for me, it's not going to get attention. Right now the archive is, well, I'll just say, resplendent with Flash animations and Flash games. People get those. They're uploading them by the hundreds, by the thousands, really. Those work. But these earlier machines, these earlier attempts to bring computing to the masses, to provide the joy of programming, are becoming scant materials with direct first-hand knowledge of what it was like to use them, unfortunately, disappearing. I don't have any way to fix that other than to provide a space for mechanisms by which people will be able to either reference these old games, play these old games, or in some way put together curated collections. And James Gerrie has done that without pay, without any particular feedback loop, and frankly, having to make his case to me over the course of weeks. I was just busy, but when it got working, James did not stop. He went for it. He enacted his plan. And as somebody who is now watching these programs, sometimes a dozen a day, join the archive, I am thoroughly impressed at what those plans are leading to. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Sembiance, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere, who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Again, it's archive.org/details/softwarelibrary_MC10. It's one of a bunch of software libraries. But watching James mount his one-person campaign to make the MC10 live again, thrive, and be a part of the current culture, it is absolutely inspiring.